Senator-Designate John Walsh will be sworn in by Vice President Joe Biden. John Walsh will replace former Democratic Senator Max Baucus, who last week was confirmed as the U.S. ambassador to China. Live now to the Senate floor on C-SPAN 2.
The Senate will come to order. The chaplain, Dr. Barry Black, will lead the Senate in prayer.
Let us pray. Eternal Spirit, clothed with honor and majesty, you make the clouds your chariot and walk upon the wind. You cause the earth to yield its harvest and send blessings to those who fear you. Guide our lawmakers today to fulfill your purposes. Lord, enable them to see the stamp of your image in each person they serve, realizing that when they lift the marginalized, they labor for you. Use them to bring order out of chaos as you keep them on the road of integrity. Reward their diligence with your bountiful blessings. We pray in your great name. Amen.
Thank you, Dr. Black. Please join me in reciting the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. The clerk will read a communication to the Senate.
Washington, D.C., February 11, 2014. To the Senate. On the provisions of Rule 1, Paragraph 3 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, I hereby appoint the Honorable Richard J. Durbin, a senator from the state of Illinois, to perform the duties of the chair, signed Patrick J. Leahy, President pro tempore.
Mr. President,
Majority Leader.
following my remarks and those of the Republican leader, the Senate will resume consideration motion to proceed to S. 1963, Military Retirement Pay Restoration Act. Senate-Designate John Walsh of Montana will become a senator today at 12:15. Senate will recess from 12:30 until 2:15 p.m. to allow for weekly caucus meetings. Today it's my pleasure to welcome the next senator from Montana, Lieutenant Governor John Walsh. Governor Walsh will be sworn in prior to the weekly caucus meetings. Mr. President, I'm really happy with this man coming here. My friend, the assistant leader, has heard me say this before, but I think it's worth repeating. When I served in the House of Representatives, I served on the Foreign Affairs Committee. And Henry Kissinger appeared before the committee, chaired by a subcommittee chaired by Congressman Solars from New York. And the congressman said to Henry Kissinger, I'm really at a loss here as to what to call you. Doctor, he was a PhD. Mr. Ambassador, he had been an ambassador. Mr. Secretary, and went through some other titles that he had had. And finally, Kissinger interrupted and said, Your Excellency would be just fine. Well, with Walsh, we have the same problem. He's been a general. He's been lieutenant governor, and it's protocol when you're lieutenant governor, you're referred to as governor. So he has a number of different titles, but soon he will be senator. I've talked to him and met him on a number of occasions. He's a fine man, and I'm confident he will find his time here among the most rewarding experiences of his distinguished career, and it is distinguished. He spent his entire adult life serving the people of Montana and our nation. Lieutenant Governor Walsh served in the Montana National Guard for more than 3 decades. After enlisting as a private, he rose to the ranks to lead Montana National Guard as Adjutant General. He led 2,000 Guardsmen in response to devastating wildfires in 2000. General Walsh also led 700 soldiers of the Montana National Guard's 1st Battalion, 163rd Infantry Regiment in combat in Iraq, and combat it was. It was some of the most difficult fighting that took place in the entire war. It was the largest mobilization of Guardsmen in Montana since World War II. The battalion was awarded the Valorous Unit Citation, and General Walsh himself received a Bronze Star for his exemplary service. In 2008, Lieutenant Governor Walsh was appointed Adjutant General of the Montana National Guard. He led the state's Guardsmen until 2012, when he retired to continue his public service in a new capacity as Lieutenant Governor of the state of Montana. Both as Adjutant General and as Lieutenant Governor, he's fought for access to education for veterans and for every Montana child. The Walsh family places great value on the power of education. Lieutenant Governor Walsh was the first member of his family to graduate from college. His wife of 29 years, Janet, has taught in the public schools in Montana for many, many years. In fact, John and Janet met while they were both attending Carroll College in Helena, Montana. They have 2 children and a grandchild, of whom they're very proud. He received his master's degree at the United States Army War College in 2007. John Walsh possesses a true independent Western spirit and a commendable dedication to the people of Montana. I have no doubt that he'll continue to serve his state and our nation with distinction as a United States Senator. In addition to swearing in Lieutenant Governor Walsh, I expect that this afternoon the Senate will adopt a motion to proceed to legislation to restore the earned pensions of military retirees. This measure restores cost of living adjustments for military retirees. And although no veteran will be affected until the end of next year, there's no reason to delay a solution. I'll continue to work with my Republican colleagues to process what we need to do to pass this important measure. We know that the A-out amendment is one the Republicans have indicated they want to vote on this, and I see no reason we shouldn't allow them to have a vote on that. Mr. President, on another topic, I was surprised this morning to hear Republicans literally howling over President Obama's decision to ease the transition for medium-sized businesses to providing health insurance for all their employees. Republicans have complained health care reform is a burden to employers. But now, Mr. President, they're complaining that President Obama is trying to ease that burden and smooth the transition to the new system. Think about that one. But this Republican duplicity should come as no surprise. After all, Republicans are the ones who invented the individual mandate. It was their idea, Mr. President. Yes, a conservative idea that every American has a responsibility to seek insurance to cover their health care needs. And the government has a responsibility to make that coverage accessible and affordable. But now Republicans are attacking their own brainchild, the individual mandate. The individual mandate was their idea. And Republicans are willfully ignoring the fact that the Affordable Care Act creates a transition period for individuals to obtain insurance as well. It's time for Republicans to stop talking out of both sides of the mouth, Mr. President. And if they have legitimate concerns about the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, and not just political gripes, they should work with the President and the Democrats in Congress to fix and improve the law. Otherwise, they should stop complaining and get out of the way.
Mr. President.
The Republican leader.
The two parties have engaged in a lot of big debates over the past several years, and no one obviously should be surprised by that. The President came into office vowing to fundamentally transform the country, and a lot of us have had big problems with the policies he's tried to implement in pursuit of that goal. But there's some things we should all agree on, and one of them is this. No president of either party should use the power of the federal government to punish his ideological opponents. That's why when the targeting of conservative groups by the IRS came to light after the last presidential election, just about everybody denounced the Nixonian tactics up and down and loudly declared that it should never be allowed to happen again. They knew that this kind of targeting represented a direct attack on our most fundamental of freedoms, on our abilities to organize and educate and engage in the democratic process. And while the abuse may have been aimed at conservatives this time, it's easy to see how it could one day be used against organizations of any ideological hue. So America's culture of civic engagement simply has to be defended by all of us. And yet, with the passage of time, that's not what we've seen. Instead of putting safeguards in place to protect our civil liberties, the Obama administration is now dragging the IRS back in the opposite direction. It's now pushing a regulation that would actually entrench and encourage the harassment of groups that dare to speak up and engage in the conversation. It's trying to intimidate and to silence those who send donations to civic groups, too. Predictably, the Obama administration has tried to spin these regulations as some sort of good government measure, as reforms initiated in response to the IRS scandal. But of course, we know that's simply not true. In recent days, we learned that these regulations designed to suppress free speech, have been in the works for years. So let's be clear, all of this is simply unacceptable. And after denouncing the abuse last year, I believe it is short-sighted of our friends on the other side not to oppose these rules forcefully today. The path this administration is embarking on is a dangerous one with the slipperiest of slopes. Left-leaning civic groups should be just as alarmed about what these regulations could mean for them in the future as what the rules almost certainly will mean for conservative groups today. That's why some, like the ACLU, have begun to speak out against these regulations. Last week, I joined several of my colleagues in sending a letter to the new commissioner of the IRS that laid out these concerns. We reminded Commissioner Koskinen that he was confirmed with a mandate to reform the IRS and return the agency to its actual mission, processing tax returns, not suppressing speech. We expect him to fulfill that mandate, to prove his reformist credentials by halting the regulations immediately and to enact new rules that would stop similar harassment from occurring in the future. This is something the Commissioner can and must do now. He needs to realize this isn't some issue to move past, but a serious threat to be confronted. Commissioner Koskinen would go down in history as a hero, just like the IRS commissioner who stood up to Nixon and said no to the harassment of political opponents. I want to believe that this is the choice he will make, that he wants to be remembered as a strong and independent public servant rather than some political pawn. But we can't be sure what he'll do, and the American people need a backup plan in case he decides his fealty lies with the opponents of free speech rather than with them. So that's why I today, along with Senators Flake, Robertson, Hatch, and others, have introduced legislation that would prevent the IRS from enacting regulations that would permit the suppression of First Amendment rights. It aims to return the agency to its mission and get it out of the speech police business altogether, a goal that should be a bipartisan one. This is something worth fighting for. It's something I hope Commissioner Koskinen will work with us to achieve. But if he doesn't, he should know that we are prepared to go to the mat to defend the First Amendment rights of our constituents and our neighbors, and that we will continue to do so until those rights are safe once again. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Under the previous order, the leadership time is reserved. Under the previous order, the Senate will resume consideration of the motion to proceed to S. 1963, which the clerk will report.
Motion to proceed to calendar number 298, S. 1963, a bill to repeal Section 403 of the Bipartisan Budget Acts of 2013.
Mr. President.
The senator from Illinois.
Mr. President, you're new to the Senate, and we're glad to have you. And you will find, I think, in the course of your senatorial experience, that occasionally good legislative ideas come from unexpected places. Occasionally, they come from phone calls to your office, emails and letters, where people tell their stories, and from those stories you see the need for a new law, a change in policy. That happened to me 13 years ago. A Korean-American mother called my office in Chicago with a problem. Her problem was that her daughter, Teresa, was about to graduate from high school and had an opportunity to go on scholarship to the Manhattan Conservatory of Music in New York. This was a poor family. Mom worked at a dry cleaner's. They barely got by, but her daughter had an extraordinary musical talent. She was an accomplished pianist even as a senior in high school, and this was her chance. As her daughter started to fill out the application form for Manhattan Conservatory of Music, there was a box that asked her to identify her nationality, her citizenship. She turned to her mom and said, "What should I put here?" And her mother said, "I'm not sure." You see, Teresa Lee was brought to the United States at the age of 2 on a visitor's visa. And when the visa expired, her mom, her dad, and she stayed in the United States and did nothing else. Technically, Teresa, having lived about 16 years in this country, was just another undocumented kid. And so they called my office and said, "What do we do about this?" Well, we checked the law. The law is very clear, Mr. President. Teresa and those just like her were to be deported from the United States for a minimum of 10 years and then be allowed to petition to come back in. That seemed to me fundamentally unfair. And so I wrote a change for the law called the DREAM Act. And the DREAM Act said, if you are a child brought to this country by parents under the age of 16, if you'll finish high school, have no serious criminal record, and you're prepared to go to college or enlist in the military, we'll put you on a path to citizenship. I introduced that 13 years ago. As you can see, the wheels of justice grind exceeding slow in the United States Senate. But over the years, this idea of the DREAM Act has really caught hold. And the reason is not because of me, it's because of the dreamers. Initially, they were frightened, afraid of deportation, raised as children in families where they were warned every day, be careful. Don't get in a position where you're going to get arrested, you'll get deported, and the whole family might get deported. We don't want to break up our family, so be careful. So they held back in the shadows, wondering, worrying about a knock on the door. Over time, though, something happened, and I can't explain it. The same kids who used to stand outside my meetings after I would talk about the DREAM Act in Chicago, waiting in the darkness and the shadows to tell me in a whisper they were dreamers, decided to step up and speak to the United States, to identify themselves. It was really an act of courage. Some people say, well, they were kids and kids do rash things. I think it was more courageous than rash. And I came to the floor on more than 50 different occasions to tell the story of the dreamers, who they are, what they've done, what they hope to do. Amazing stories, incredible stories of young people across America just asking for a chance to be legalized, to be part of America's future. They felt they were Americans start to finish. Your colleague, Senator Bob Menendez, used to talk about Hispanics, who are the largest group of dreamers, standing in those classrooms, hand over their heart, pledging allegiance to the only flag they've ever known. who faced the cruel reality that they were not going to be American citizens unless we changed the law. Here's the good news, Mr. President. Over time, a long time, 13 years, the sentiment, not just of the American people, but of members of Congress, started to change. Change for the better. The House of Representatives enacted the DREAM Act. Even the Senate and Comprehensive Immigration Reform Bill this last year enacted the strongest DREAM Act ever written. In fact, just last week, when Speaker Boehner, in the midst of his examination, if you will, of the immigration issue, issued a statement of principles, smack dab in the middle of it, in clear language, was an endorsement of the DREAM Act. So, though the Speaker may have some misgivings, and I'm sorry to say I disagree with him, but may have some misgivings about comprehensive immigration reform, he acknowledged that on a bipartisan basis, the DREAM Act was something that both parties should embrace. I still believe in comprehensive immigration reform. The Dreamers will be the first to say, don't forget my mom and dad when you're talking about immigration reform. But the reason I give this preface to my remarks is to put in perspective an amendment which will be on the floor of the Senate this week, offered by Senator Kelly Ayotte of New Hampshire. It is an amendment which addresses a provision of the tax code. Here is what our laws currently say when it comes to taxes and families working in America. If you are undocumented, you are not legally allowed to work in America. That's what the law says. But if you do work in America, even undocumented, you have a legal obligation to pay your taxes. So how would an undocumented worker pay their taxes? Well, they would have an I-10, they call it, a basic identification number that they can use to file their tax returns. And so many do. Undocumented workers here in the United States pay their income taxes as required by law. One of the provisions in our tax code for every taxpayer says that if you're in certain income categories, you are allowed to claim a credit for your children. It helps 38 million American families who take this credit on their tax returns because they are working families and have children, and the tax code said we will help you raise your children. On its face, it's worth about $1,000 a year in reduced taxes. But there are limitations. If your income reaches certain levels, you don't qualify for this child tax credit. Now comes Senator Ayotte and makes a proposal that we basically change this child tax credit as it applies to the tax-paying undocumented workers, that we say to them their children can only be claimed for this child tax credit if the children can produce a Social Security number. Therein lies the problem. Because many of these children, though they're legally claimed today, don't have a Social Security number. Let's talk about Dreamers, because that's a group that is affected most directly by the Ayotte Amendment. Dreamers, those who would qualify if the DREAM Act becomes law, have been given a special status because of President Obama. He created a deferred deportation, deferred action program so that Dreamers could step up, identify themselves to the government, register, be given a work permit, and be allowed to apply for a Social Security number. DACA, it is called. We estimate that there are about 2.1 million eligible Dreamers in America for the law that I want to change. So far, 500,000 of them have applied for DACA and therefore can obtain Social Security numbers. That leaves 1.6 million Dreamers who cannot, under the Ayotte Amendment, be counted as children under the child tax credit. So ultimately, what Senator Ayotte is doing is to deny those who are working in America and paying their income taxes that provision of the tax code which says you get a special consideration for your children. I think that's just plain wrong. Listen to these numbers. The child tax credit, a refundable credit for working families of $1,000 for each child under the age of 17. It is limited, as I mentioned earlier. The tax credit can be The most that anyone can claim for the tax credit is 15% of family income minus $3,000, regardless of the number of children. For example, minimum wage worker earning $14,500 with 2 or more children would receive at most $1,725 as a tax credit or refundable tax credit. The credit is only available for taxpayers who are working, earning income, and raising children. The AOT amendment, though, has to be put in this perspective. Nearly 38 million families are expected to benefit from this child tax credit this year. I should say this year filing for last year's income. 60% of those who claim this tax credit earn less than $25,000 a year. Nearly half of the workers whose members of families working in America claiming the child tax credit earn $10 an hour or less. And 90% of those who would be hurt by the AOT amendment are Hispanic. The tax credit is legally available for qualified taxpayers who have children with the I-10s. These are individual tax identification numbers. And not everyone who uses an I-10 is undocumented. This amendment, the AOT amendment, would also affect lawfully present children who use I-10s, including victims of human trafficking, dreamers, as I mentioned, under DACA, Cuban and Haitian entrants, and those with a pending application for asylum. The child tax credit, we estimate, lifts about 3 million people, including 1.5 million children, out of poverty every year. It's an incentive for these low-income families who are working and paying taxes but not earning enough to take care of their kids. The AOT amendment would eliminate the use of a tax credit for 1 million children, pushing many low and moderate income families with children deeper into poverty. What Senator Ayotte is trying to do is to use the proceeds from this amendment she's offering to pay for the cost of living adjustment under the military pensions. Mr. President, those veterans have already paid for their pensions. They paid by volunteering to serve this country and risk their lives. Some of them have come home with visible and invisible wounds of war that will be with them for a lifetime. I don't believe we should come up with a pay-for something these veterans have already paid for, number one. And number two, I think it is just unacceptable for the United States. Mr. President, I ask the Senate to come to order.
The Senate will be in order.
Mr. President, in addition to that, I think it is unfair for us to impoverish more children in America as a means of helping our veterans. What a cruel choice to put before the United States Senate. And don't take my word for it. I ask consent that the statement I'm about to refer to be placed in the record at this point.
Without objection.
Mr. President, Sister Simone Campbell is somebody who I greatly respect. Sister Simone Campbell is Executive Director of Network, a national Catholic social justice lobby. She is also one of the organizers of Nuns on the Bus, Catholic nuns who have traveled all over the United States speaking out on issues of social justice. She has sent us a statement opposing the AOT amendment. It's a lengthy statement. I won't read it all, but I do want to read several parts that I think are important. Sister Simone Campbell says, to set the record straight, children targeted by the AOT amendment do exist, and they do live in the U.S. 4 million of them are U.S. citizens. Others are little dreamers, young children brought to this country by their families. Under existing tax laws, their families may apply for the child tax credit if they qualify financially. If fraud is suspected, the solution is not to deny all eligible children access to this critical anti-poverty program. That is cruel and ineffective. Those are the words of Sister Simone Campbell in reference to this proposed amendment. She concludes by saying, responsible leaders in Congress should look into their hearts and reject proposals like this one pushed by Senator Ayotte. This political tactic is not good for our economy or the well-being of the entire nation, especially children who are the future of our country. We are better than this. Mr. President, I agree with Sister Campbell. Why is it, week after week, from the other side of the aisle, from the other side of the rotunda, we hear proposal after proposal to make it harder for working families, and particularly lower income families, to get by in America. When we talk about unemployment benefits for those who've lost their job so they can find additional work, only 4 Republican senators would step up and join us in that effort. When we talk about extending the minimum wage so that those who get up and go to work every single day have a fighting chance, the opposition consistently comes from the other side of the aisle. And now we have before us this proposal to change the tax code to the disadvantage of the poorest workers and the poorest families and the poorest children in America. We are better than this. Sister Campbell is right. I would say to my colleagues, if you believe in the DREAM Act, and many of you have said you do, you cannot vote for the Ayotte amendment without realizing what it does to these children. To impoverish these children on one day in the Senate, and before that say we think they should be citizens someday, we've got to have a consistent moral ethic when it comes to the way we treat children in America. Denying children the most basics in life, whether it's food stamps or assistance on the tax returns of their parents, is just not what America should be about. This Ayotte amendment will really call in question our dedication to these kids and their families. These workers are stepping up, meeting their legal obligation to pay their taxes. All they're asking for is to be treated like everyone else under the tax code. The Ayotte amendment will deny that to millions of these children. That is absolutely unacceptable. Now let me address a very real issue. Senator Ayotte has identified some instances, I don't know how many, of fraud in the use of this child tax credit. I stand with her in trying to fight back and end that fraud. But let's be honest. A person making barely minimum wage, filing their tax returns and claiming this credit is not likely to set out to game the system. The people who are gaming the system are the tax preparers. They're the ones who may be lying to the government, guilty of fraud. I will join with Senator Ayotte and any other colleague who wants to stop that perpetration of fraud. I don't stand for fraud in any program. I don't think any senator would. But to take this out on the children and low-income taxpayers is just plain wrong. I urge my colleagues, let's stand by the veterans, restore their pensions. Let's do it as quickly as we can. But please, do not help our veterans at the expense of children in America. This is an important amendment. It is one that calls into question our values, and I urge my colleagues to look at this very carefully. The last point I will make before I yield the floor, I see other colleagues here. I support comprehensive immigration reform. If the Ayotte amendment is enacted into law, the cost of bringing the Dreamers into citizenship has just gone up by billions of dollars, which we will have to raise to undo the Ayotte amendment at a future time. Let's not put ourselves in that position for the good of these children and their families, and to put this nation in the right place by fixing our broken immigration system. I urge my colleagues to oppose the Ayotte amendment. Yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The senator from Arizona.
I ask unanimous consent to enter into a colloquy with my colleagues.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I rise today to bring attention to the latest installment concerning political targeting by the IRS. Last spring, we learned that the IRS's targeting of conservative groups that were applying for 501c4 tax-exempt status, thanks to a report by the IRS's Inspector General. This report detailed how the IRS singled out conservative groups for excessive scrutiny, which caused some applications to lie pending for more than 3 years, and another 28 organizations to actually give up on their unanswered applications. The President claims this targeting was due solely to, quote, boneheaded decisions, unquote. Unfortunately, with the head of the tax-exempt organizations unit at the agency, Lois Lerner, choosing to plead the Fifth and resign rather than answer questions before Congress, we may find that the source of this problem is a little more troubling than that. Thankfully, multiple investigations are taking place to answer lingering questions such as this one. I look forward to their findings, wherever they may lead. Uncovering who directed and participated in the inappropriate targeting and why will allow us to bring justice to the groups affected and ensure that no such targeting like this occurs again. So imagine my surprise when, over the Thanksgiving holiday, I learned that the IRS had diagnosed the problem and offered its regulatory solution despite the fact that multiple investigations are far from complete. On Friday, November 29th, without warning, the IRS published a proposed rule that would restrict the activities of 501c4 organizations, effectively limiting their speech and curtail their civic participation. Now, this brings a whole new meaning to the term Black Friday. This rule singles out the same conservative groups that were previously targeted by the IRS and threatens to shut them down. It further attempts to legitimize the targeting of organizations that hold ideological views that are inconsistent with the administration's views. It should be no surprise, since critics of these conservative organizations have openly called for their extinction, that this is occurring. At the least, some would like to force 501c4 organizations to ill-fitting structures devised more appropriately for political committees in order to require the disclosure of conservative supporters. The IRS and the White House claim innocently that the proposed rule is meant to clear up confusion about how the process of applications for 501c4 organizations are involved in political activities. Over the past several months, we've heard this administration tell the public multiple times how confusing the applications are. Yet, 501c4 applications have been processed for years without excessive complaints of confusion that have occurred in recent months. In fact, before the IRS began flagging the applications of conservative groups on February in 2010, these types of applications were being processed within 3 months. Email traffic between IRS employees shows that the applications of conservative organizations were not flagged out of confusion, but rather because of media attention and potential interest to Washington. So let's call this rule what it is. It's an attempt to silence the voices of conservative organizations. To be clear, 501c4s are permitted to engage in the political process and in political discourse, and they should continue to be allowed to do so. But this regulation seeks to limit their participation in a host of advocacy and education activities, even nonpartisan voter registration and education drives. These activities have a clear role in promoting civic engagement and social welfare, the precise purpose of the 501c4 structure. Unfortunately, the rule would suppress conservative voices by forcing organizations to quit these activities or to be shut down. In fact, according to evidence collected by the House Ways and Means Committee, Chairman Dave Camp, the administration has been working on this rule since 2011. Not surprisingly, the Treasury Department kept quiet of its plans. In fact, it neglected to mention consideration of this rule in the agency's 2011 or 2012 policy guidance plan, and these are usually which detail upcoming projects. If it sounds suspicious, it is. Just 3 months after the IRS abuse surfaced, the Treasury Department listed in its 2013 plan the development of guidance related to the political activities of 501c4s. Conveniently, the publicity of the IRS abuse provided an opportunity to finally roll out the agency's rule as a solution to its, quote, boneheaded decisions. But this administration is not fooling anyone. Over 20,000 people have already submitted comments to the proposed rule. According to the new IRS commissioner, this is the largest number of comments ever received by any agency. Clearly, the public sees through the administration's veiled attempt to squash free speech and to shut down opposition to its priorities. This is not a way to win back trust. Just this past December, the IRS commissioner, known for his ability to turn around organizations, was confirmed as the new IRS commissioner. This is John Koshkinen. He promised to work toward restoring trust to the scandal-ridden agency, but he has yet to turn things around and is allowing this politically charged rule to move ahead. So I come to the floor today, along with my friend from Kansas, Senator Roberts, and with the support of 37 additional members to this body, to introduce legislation to stop the rule's implementation. I see Senator Hatch from Utah, Senator Cornyn of Texas, who will also speak to this in a moment. The Stop Targeting of Political Beliefs by the IRS Act will prevent this rule or any other that seeks to continue the targeting of groups based on their ideology. It's time to end the intimidation and harassment. Let's preserve the First Amendment rights of all groups, regardless of their ideology, especially those that commit themselves to improving our society. And let's restore the public's faith in the ability of the IRS to fairly administer our nation's laws. I hope the rest of the Senate will join us in this effort. I look forward to coming back to the floor later in the week to ask unanimous consent to pass this legislation outright. Mr. President, I would yield the floor to my friend from Kansas, Senator Roberts.
Mr. President, I would first like to thank my colleagues for working with Senator Flake and myself to bring this proposal forward. This is a critical issue, one that really gets straight to the heart of our American democracy. The current investigations of the IRS clearly show it is not an overreaction, I don't think, to say that the Internal Revenue Service did suppress political opposition. Now, to Kansans, to Arizonans, to Texans, to Utahns all across the country, and to my colleagues, this is not only a scandal, but one that is egregious. There is a great deal more than a smidgen at stake here. It gets right to the heart of our system of government. The government must be held accountable for its actions and must never be permitted to trample on the constitutional rights of our citizens. The behavior of the IRS in singling out select groups at their discretion for extra scrutiny and harassment just because they hold views that differ from the administration is simply outrageous. Worse, the IRS continues to target groups whose politics doesn't like even as we speak here on the floor of the Senate. And in fact, the proposed IRS 501c4 regulations will even more directly prevent groups the IRS doesn't favor from really participating in the political process. The proposed regulations would place much tougher controls on what would be considered political activity, effectively blocking the normal practice of a wide range of not-for-profit organizations, not only conservatives. Under the proposed rules, healthy debate and discussion of political issues, political candidates, and congressional actions would be prohibited. This is, in effect, suppression of free speech for these Americans. The proposed regulations would result in continued sanctioned intimidation and harassment of these groups and permit the federal government to be used as a partisan tool. We recently learned that the proposed regulations have been under development for some time. Senator Flake has just mentioned this. This is nothing new, perhaps as far back as 2011, some say even 2010. Now these proposed regulations, until recently, have been considered offline. My colleagues, pay attention to this, offline. Offline means that the regs are being considered outside the normal regulatory process, which in my view has been done in order to circumvent the Administrative Procedures Act. There's no transparency here. I cannot help but think that all of this, the targeting, the slow walking of exemption applications, the proposed regulations are part of a calculated plan to deny unfavored groups their First Amendment right to participate in the political process of the nation. My colleagues, this is simple. What we are seeing is a deliberate effort to infringe the people's First Amendment rights. It's incredible. I never thought I would live to see the day that this happened in the United States, that we would have to be debating this. This is a copy of the Constitution of the United States. First Amendment by James Madison. This was given to me by Robert C. Byrd, the institutional flame of the Senate, who sat right over there to the left of the distinguished ranking member from Utah, and I know that, who is our Republican lead in regards to the investigation of all of this in the Finance Committee. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof or abridging the freedom of speech. The freedom of speech, my colleagues, or the press or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. As former chair of the Intelligence Committee, I can tell you that the arrogant response of the administration to the IRS actions, the denials, the evasions, the attempts to downgrade the implications of the IRS efforts, and now counter-accusations, they look like they came from some counter-espionage handbook. Here's the real problem. The IRS has proposed these regulations before Congress has even completed, as the senator from Arizona has pointed out, its investigation of the agency's actions in these matters. The manner in which these regulations have come up raised questions about the integrity of the rulemaking process, the exact opposite direction the agency should be taking. Even worse, the IRS proceeds with these rules when they have done as much as possible to slow down the Finance Committee's investigation. I'm a member of that committee. Senator Hatch is leading the effort on the Republican side by responding to document requests at a glacial pace at best and redacting large amounts of critical information. Now, Senator Flake and I have really proposed a very straightforward, very common-sense approach to this entire mess. We simply halt further action on the proposed regulations until the Justice Department and the congressional investigations by the House Ways and Means Committee and the Senate Finance Committee into the IRS actions are complete. The bill freezes further IR action for 1 year and would make it clear that the IRS can only enforce the regulations that were in place before all this mess began. It is no wonder, given the IRS's behavior, that Kansans and virtually every American with every good reason doubt that the agency can in good faith administer not only this but the tax code. Clearly, the IRS has no capacity to regulate any political activity without running roughshod over the people's fundamental constitutional rights. I have said this many times, but the scandal also shows the IRS is too big, too intrusive, and too involved in taxpayers' business. The time for us to scale it back is now. In fact, it's easily the most distrusted agency in the federal government. That's a shame. The IRS has become a four-letter word. This growing lack of faith in the IRS is a very strong reason why Congress should consider a wholesale rewrite of the tax system by simplifying tax collection and reducing the government's intrusion into economic and other affairs of the public. This is the main reason I am supporting legislation to scrap the tax code and move to a simplified single-rate tax system. We do not need the IRS regulating constitutionally guaranteed free speech and muzzling lawful activity in regards to politics and taking part as a partner in government. Will Rogers once said, the difference between death and taxes is that death doesn't get worse every time Congress meets. Well, today Will Rogers is wrong. It's not Congress that's making things worse, it's the IRS. So let's pass this bill and work to get the IRS out of Americans' lives and their freedom of speech. And I thank Senator Flake again for being a co-sponsor of the legislation.
From Kansas, and would yield now to the gentleman from Utah, the ranking minority member on the Finance Committee.
Well, I thank my colleague from Arizona and my colleague from Kansas as well. Mr. President, I rise today in support of the Stop Targeting of Political Beliefs by the IRS Act. The bill introduced today by our senator from Arizona and the senior senator from Kansas. This is a Senate companion bill to the bill being marked up today in the House Ways and Means Committee. This is an important piece of legislation that will protect free speech and ensure, at least for the time being, that the Internal Revenue Service is not used as yet another political arm of this administration. As we all know, last November, the IRS unveiled proposed regulations that would fundamentally alter the nature of the activities that tax-exempt 501c4 organizations can engage in. Under current regulations, 501c4 organizations, or social welfare groups, can engage in political activities on a limited basis so long as their primary activity is the production and promotion of social welfare. However, they remain free to educate the public on important issues, even those that may be politically charged, because that falls within the exempt purpose of promoting social welfare.
They can also conduct voter registration drives and distribute voter guides outlining candidates' priorities on issues important to the organization. Under the proposed regulation, virtually all of these activities would be considered political activities and would be considered inconsistent with various groups' exemptions under 501c4 of the Internal Revenue Code. As a practical matter, this would mean that grassroots organizations all over the country would be forced to shut down. Or to put it more bluntly, grassroots conservative organizations all over this country would be forced to shut down. And, Mr. President, that's precisely the point. The Obama administration does not want grassroots organizations, even those that are legitimately nonpartisan, educating the public on issues of the day. They don't want tax-exempt organizations to be able to tell voters where candidates and politicians stand on the issues. And they certainly don't want these types of groups participating in the political process in any meaningful way. That's why we're seeing these regulations. That's why they were drafted in the first place. And that's why the administration seems to set to finalize them right before the 2014 midterm elections, or at the very latest, before the 2016 presidential election. We need to call this what it is, Mr. President. This is an affront to free speech and the right of all American citizens to participate in the democratic process. This is an attempt by the Obama administration to further marginalize its critics and keep them on the sidelines. It is a blatant attempt to continue the harassment and intimidation that has already been taking place at the IRS over the past few years. This regulation is just one of many problems we see at the IRS. Indeed, the American people have ample reason to doubt the credibility of the IRS, particularly when it comes to dealing with organizations that might be critical of the President and his policies. The IRS is currently under investigation on 3 separate congressional committees for its targeting of conservative organizations during the run-up to the 2010 and 2012 elections. On top of that, the agency recently came under widespread condemnation when, in the midst of these ongoing investigations, they announced that they were reinstating bonuses that have been canceled in response to the targeting scandal. It's almost as if they believe there was no scandal at all. And the President tries to get people to believe that as well, and we all know that's pure bunk. Of course, if you've been listening to other people in the Obama administration, that type of thinking appears to be the predominant view. Several weeks ago, for example, leaks from the Justice Department indicated that no criminal charges were likely to be found in the targeting scandal, even though this scandal is still under investigation. Talk about politics. Talk about political control. Talk about ignoring what's going on. And on Super Bowl Sunday, President Obama said in an interview that there was not a, quote, smidgen, unquote, of corruption at the IRS. Well, Mr. President, when it comes to suppressing free speech, there is far more than a smidgen of corruption at the IRS. And if anything, these proposed regulations on 501c4s are additional proof. It's one side trying to one-up the other in all cases because they happen to control the presidency and one house of Congress. When the proposed rule was first made public, the IRS said that it was drafted in response to the 2013 TIGDA report that revealed all the issues the agency was having with regard to 501c4 applications. However, as we learned in a Ways and Means Committee hearing last week, those regulations were under consideration for 2 years before the report was issued. 2 years. On top of that, the regulations were pursued outside of the normal channels for IRS and Treasury Department regulatory efforts in a manner that some IRS officials labeled, quote, off-plan, unquote. Off-plan in this case means hidden, H-I-D-D-E-N, from the public. Now, why does the IRS need to hide a draft regulation from the public when a regulation project is normally listed on a public Treasury guidance plan? I suppose we can only speculate, but I think it's fair to assume that they didn't want the public to know that these regulations were in the works. And they expect the American people to believe that there is no political motivation for these regulations. Give me a break. The fact of the matter is these proposed regulations demonstrate that the IRS is willing and able to carry the President's political water, even when the agency is, by law, supposed to be an independent and nonpartisan agency. That's why this legislation that has been introduced today by the two distinguished senators who preceded me in their remarks is so important. We need to send a message to the administration that it cannot tamper with the rules of free speech just because it doesn't like what's being said. If enacted, this legislation would delay the implementation for these rules for a year. This is the least we can do to protect free speech, Mr. President. People from all across the political spectrum, from the ACLU to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce to the unions, have recognized just how egregious this proposed rule is. It needs to be stopped, and our bill would stop it. I urge my colleagues to support this legislation. Indeed, everyone who supports the right of American citizens to participate in the political process, whether they're Republican or Democrat, should support this bill. And I might just say to our new commissioner, who I fought to get confirmed, who I believe is sincere, who I believe is a person who can clean up this mess over there, this nest of partisan people who are in the IRS where there should not be any partisanship. Mr. Koskinen, I'll just say to Mr. Koskinen, you have the power to stop this regulation from becoming final. The commissioner should stop this. All he has to do is just not sign it. And I've got to say that I'll be watching very, very carefully because I'm sick and tired of the IRS being used for political purposes. I don't want it to be used for Republican purposes or Democrat purposes, for liberal purposes or conservative purposes. I want freedom in this country, and I want people to be able to express themselves freely. It's outrageous what they're trying to do. And it shows an administration that can't win fair and square with all of the advantages that it has. 501c4s are basically organizations that have a conservative tilt. 501c5s are the unions that we know almost 100% support Democrats, even though 40% of union members are Republicans. I know. I used to be a skilled tradesman. I learned a skilled trade, went through a formal apprenticeship, worked for 10 years in the building construction trade unions. I'm proud of that. I was proud to be a union member. 40% union members are Republicans, yet almost 100% of their effort goes to elect Democrats. By the way, the uptick in 501c5s was just as high as the uptick for conservative organizations in 501c4s. We didn't see any of this stuff being used against 501c5s. The only thing you can conclude is that there's a group of people who basically want to support only one side of the equation. We've got to get politics out of the IRS. I don't know what that means. It may mean, like other agencies where we don't want any politics involved, getting rid of any partisan controls. That might include the union. Because we got people that were partisan here, that did wrong things. Our investigation's not complete, but it is a matter of great concern to us. And then to come up with this type of stuff, it's enough to make you just want to cry. Or should I say, throw up. Look, I'm a Republican. Mr. President, you're a Democrat. We're friends. We don't agree on a lot of things. That's what makes this country great. But when one side tries to stifle the free speech of the other side, we both have to stand together. And I hope Mr. Koskinen, the new commissioner, will do what's right here and get rid of these regulations. My gosh, let's not have regulations that give a tilt to one side or the other. Let's have the IRS be down the middle, straightforward, decent and honest, which it has not been in the last number of years. And we're going to show that. All I can say is I commend my two colleagues for their leadership in bringing this bill to the floor. It's long overdue, and I hope that every senator in this Senate will support it. I yield the floor.
I appreciate his recitation of the chronology here and how this happened. These regulations are supposedly in response to the scandal that came up, although the President is not calling it a scandal, said there's not